Welcome to the presentation of the developmental effects of emotional or psychological abuse on school-age children. This presentation is for Colorado Christian University Human Growth and Development, and it's going to be presented by Carly Perry, Drew Cornock, Renee Collins, and myself, Juan Vasquez. We chose this topic all collectively because we found it of high interest as we decided to become counselors. And we all agreed that there seems to be a lack of engagement towards psychological abuse when you compare it to physical or sexual abuse. So we all had this assumption and we wanted to see if we could prove it or deny it. In the following slides, we just confirm our belief, and we're going to do it by covering the importance of the topic of psychological abuse for children in the counseling industry, its relevance within minority communities, the relevant treatments, interventions, and strategies for counselors, its biblical perspective, literature review, an individual perspective from each presenter, and our references. So now we're going to have Carly cover the importance of the topic to the counseling field.
Hi, so I'm going to begin by talking about an article discussing childhood abuse and current psychological functioning in a university counseling center. This article states that the specific issue is more common than one may think, and just because the signs are not on the outside does not mean that they aren't there, and it is becoming more socially acceptable to talk about it. This issue has been identified as one of the several areas thought to account for the dramatic surge in the number of clients and severity of presenting problems at university counseling centers in recent years. Childhood psychological and emotional abuse can affect an individual long into their adulthood. One can be affected in multiple ways, including anxiety, feelings of isolation and stigma, poor self-esteem, difficulty trusting others, tendency towards re-victimization, substance abuse, feelings of powerlessness, and much more. This issue presents numerous psychological difficulties. A study was done on college campuses examining the differences between mental health abuse and non-abuse clients. The results showed that those who did report childhood abuse showed that they were suffering significantly greater psychological difficulties than were clients reporting no abuse at all. Those who have been abused early on in life experience something called survival brain. People who have experienced psychological abuse early on have what we call survival brain instead of what they should have, which is called learning brain. Childhood and adolescence are periods in which the brain is developing rapidly and is a crucial time for cognitive skills. If children and adolescents spend too much time in survival mode, they are not accessing areas in the brain that are responsible for learning developmentally appropriate cognitive skills and laying down the neural pathways that are critical to future learning. This is why this is so important to counseling, as we may be working with children who have been abused, who are being abused, or adults who have been abused in the past as children and have held on to it for many, many years and are finally stepping out to get help. So now Drew will be covering the relevance of this topic.
In the following slides, I will explore the perspectives of minority populations in the U.S. on the emotional abuse of school-age children. Relating to the perspectives of minority populations on emotional abuse, Alexander adds that social determinants, developmental issues, community norms, and preferred models of prevention are all molded by culture. One aspect of culture that influences the relevance of emotional abuse among minority populations includes methods of discipline or punishment. For example, to avoid using physical punishment, many Asian American parents believe that shaming is an effective method of discipline. Also, in many cultures with the mother as a main caregiver, children experience a greater risk of emotional abuse from the disciplinarian father. Another influence includes the level of adaptation of a minority to the dominant culture. A minority's perspective on emotional abuse may create conflict with the beliefs, boundaries, and/or definitions of abuse of his or her new culture. For example, isolation of a child may be a normal part of development in one's culture, but seen as a potential psychological abuse in America that can raise concerns for the parents if they fail to adjust to the new culture. An adverse influence among minority populations includes racism, discrimination, and bias from other populations. Victims of emotional abuse may resist reporting due to noticeable or perceived discrimination from authorities or institutional racism. A child or non-abusive parent may decide not to report abuse from the belief that authorities will not believe or act on the reported abuse because his or her race, ethnicity, or social economical status. Although certain elements of emotional abuse among minority populations appear to mirror those of the majority population in the US, minority populations have additional circumstances and contributors to where and when emotional abuse appears, the causes or antecedents of abuse, and the effects of the abuse on the victim. Emotional abuse of school-age children occurs most often among minority groups with high poverty rates and a greater isolation from other groups. Similar to the majority populations, higher poverty rates among minority populations coincide with higher reported emotional abuse rates. However, according to Alexander, children from the Black and Hispanic minority groups are about 3 times more likely to be poor than white children. In a recent study, Nagin, Salandi, and Diaz discovered that urban African American and Latino school-age children who are born outside of the US reported experiencing emotional abuse 10% more than those born in the US. This difference is likely associated with the foreign-born minority group's separation from other groups or cultural isolation. Some of the causes or antecedents of emotional abuse among minority populations include assimilation, stress, and historical trauma. Since assimilation involves letting go of pieces of one's culture and adjusting to a significant change in cultural context, this presents a unique challenge for some that leads to unhealthy stress and anxiety. Alexander adds that Korean mothers have reported family acculturation conflicts to be a significant factor in their attitudes about emotional maltreatment of children. The stressors of assimilation include language barriers, lack of culturally appropriate resources, and limited social networks. These stressors can create negative emotions that parents or caregivers project onto their children, often as a scapegoat to his or her conflicts, which often lead to psychological abuse. Many minority populations in the US also experience historical trauma from past maltreatments, which include negative behaviors passed down from previous generations. Some minorities have witnessed or experienced similar abuse from family members and reflect these negative behaviors from historical trauma onto their children through verbal belittling or ridiculing. Many child abuse authorities report that while the prevalence and severity of emotional abuse differs across populations, a minority child's reactions to emotional or psychological abuse are quite often similar to those of other populations. However, although the types of developmental effects are similar, such as social or emotional issues, resilience to the abuse appears to be stronger in minority populations. Children and non-abusive adults may hide or placate abuse and its effects to maintain cultural unity and prevent conflict among the family and/or community. Positive interventions from family members, a strong support system, or the intrinsic qualities of one's culture, such as a strong sense of survival and determination, also add strength to a child's resilience to emotional abuse. And now Renee will cover relevant treatments, interventions, and counseling strategies.
Thank you. Before discussing the clinical treatment of emotional and mental abuse among school-aged children, it's important to examine the challenges that both keep the children from the care they need and make it difficult for a counselor or mental health provider to treat the resulting symptoms. The first obstacle comes with the fact that children can have trouble understanding that what they are experiencing is abuse. And even if they do, it can be difficult to articulate to others what's taking place and how it's hurting them. Often for a victim, identifying what they suffer is emotional abuse does not come until their adult years. In addition to being difficult to identify, emotional abuse can also be difficult to prove, as it does not leave visible evidence such as scars or bruises. And the way the evidence of abuse does manifest, low self-esteem, impulsivity, and behaviors such as tics, tantrums, stealing, and clinginess could all be interpreted as typical behavior problems to an untrained observer. Another difficulty in identifying this trauma is that children who suffer from emotional abuse are kept in a nightmarish cycle of secrecy, fear, and shame. Parents who abuse demand that the victim keep quiet about what's happening, and the child often obeys out of fear of their parent, and perhaps paradoxically fear that their parent or abuser will be discovered and punished. One of the hallmarks of abuse is that the victim believes the cruelty they suffer is their own fault, and this shame keeps them silent and the abuse hidden. And finally, in spite of the pervasive problem of emotional abuse among children, studies show that emotional abuse is investigated dramatically less than physical or sexual abuse. Dr. Christopher Wilderman states, retrospective self-reports indicate that in excess of 40% of children will be maltreated during childhood. In contrast, official CPS data indicate that far fewer children experience maltreatment. For example, in 2011, only 0.9% of children were confirmed as victims of maltreatment. It remains unclear whether or not this disparity reflects a lack of children telling others about the abuse they suffer, or if there still remains an impression that emotional abuse is not as serious as other kinds of abuse, such as physical or sexual abuse. In a recent study published by the American Psychological Association, the link was examined between emotional abuse and serious trauma and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Among their findings was the assertion that emotional abuse in childhood carried just as much trauma and damage as sexual or physical abuse. The lead author of the study, Dr. Joseph Spinazzola, concluded, given the prevalence of childhood psychological abuse and the severity of harm to young victims, it should be at the forefront of mental health and social service training. A strong obligation then falls to counselors and mental health providers to acknowledge the severity of the issue and seek increased training in how to recognize the signs of emotional abuse in children. It should be stated that the majority of victims of childhood psychological abuse do not receive treatment until they are in their adult years. For the purpose of this presentation, we're focused on the treatment modalities for victims who are school-aged children. In the statistically rare case that a child is brought to a counselor for treatment of emotional abuse, the treatments are similar to those that address other trauma. Sherry Lefevre, a licensed professional counselor who specializes in treating children, stated that play-based therapy stands as the current favored modality. Given the inability of children to articulate or even identify their trauma, play-based therapy is child-centered and non-directive. The therapist brings a child into a space with toys and art or other activities and allows them to explore and express freely, and this presents an opportunity to carefully observe and analyze. Other forms of play-based therapy, such as filial therapy and attachment-based therapy, involve the parents in the process of observation and discussion. In filial therapy, a counselor essentially trains the parents to be a counselor to their own child, to create a pattern of observation and analysis. These forms of therapy strengthen the attachment bond between the parent and child. Ms. Lefevre discussed the opportunity that these modalities offer for parents to both treat the child and the parent at the same time, hopefully addressing some of the main issues. Ms. Lefevre also discussed the dire need in some cities and even entire regions for mental health professionals who are specially trained to work with children who have suffered trauma, such as emotional abuse. Wait lists and scarcity present yet another obstacle for an abused child to get the treatment he or she desperately needs. We're now going to discuss the biblical worldview perspective with Juan.
Thank you, Renee. So when we talk about the biblical worldview in reference to this specific topic, just like many other topics, it's really hard to find specific verses that speak of emotional abuse with children. But we do have some foundational literature inside the Bible that speaks of God's expectations of us in reference to how we treat others. And just to name a few, we have three here, and we have 1 Corinthians 13, which speaks of love not being rude, self-seeking, easily angered, not keeping record of wrongs, and it always protects. More specific verses cover that we should put away anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talks from our mouths. And this is very important because just because we're afforded the opportunity to be parents doesn't give us free room and reign to develop our children the way we think we should. We should really apply the same love and the same type of kindness that we apply to other and adults to our own children. And I think this is something that we need to follow. Ephesians 4:31-32 states that we should all the bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be away from us, along with malice. And I like the fact that these two last verses spoke about slander, because we can mistakenly belittle our children, and that's not appropriate. So now we're going to move into the literature review, and I'm going to let Carly speak on this topic.
I'm going to be talking about our literature review and important points that we wanted to pull out of each for this project. The first being, psychological maltreatment has been difficult for researchers and lawmakers to define. The Federal Child Abuse and Prevention Treatment Act 42 defines emotional abuse as a repeated pattern of caregiver behavior or extreme incidents that convey to children that they are worthless, flawed, unwanted, endangered, or only of value in meeting another's needs. Since this definition is vague, most legislatures have defined emotional abuse and neglect individually. However, emotional neglect is more often than not overlooked. The American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children has since recognized 6 forms of maltreatment to help this issue. These include spurning, terrorizing, isolating, exploiting or corrupting, denying emotional responsiveness, and unwarranted denial of mental health care, medical care, or education. Psychological abuse is rarely addressed in prevention programs or in treating victims. It is not commonly known, but children who are emotionally abused or neglected face similar and sometimes worse mental health problems as children who are physically or sexually abused. A research project was done to analyze children with one or more of the 3 types of abuse, those being psychological maltreatment, psychical abuse, and sexual abuse. The majority, at 62%, had a history of psychological maltreatment, and nearly 24% of these cases were exclusively psychological maltreatment. Children who are psychologically abused suffer significantly and are affected long into their adult lives. They suffer from anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, symptoms of PTSD, and suicidality at the same rate, and in some cases worse than children who were sexually assaulted. Sexual and physical abuse had to occur at the same time to have the same effect as psychological abuse alone. For this next slide, a study was done to analyze African American and Latino youth. This study focused on a history of abuse where there is no history of depression. Findings were that depression had a significant main effect on grades, while abuse did not. But abuse and depression had a significant interactive effect on grades in that non-depressed adolescents who reported abuse had an almost 4-point higher average score than their non-depressed counterparts who did not report abuse. The child and parent attachment is extremely important to child's psychological development. Children need acceptance, love, encouragement, discipline, consistency, stability, and positive attention. A number of authors have proposed specific interventions to enhance these relationships, as well as teach the abused child new methods for structuring experiences, thus enhancing social competence and setting a better foundation for their development. This article offers some examples of what to do if you feel you are not embodying these qualities, such as never being afraid to apologize to your child, not calling your child names or labeling them, addressing the behavior that needs correcting, and using the appropriate discipline techniques, as well as complimenting your child even when they complete a minuscule task, just to name a few. Culture plays a huge role in dealing with psychological abuse. Culture plays a huge role in this because, as an example, some cultures refrain from talking about sex completely, and this could discourage a child to disclose whether or not they were sexually assaulted. Programs that are in place to help this issue are called multicultural and cultural specific prevention programs. Emotional abuse is dramatically worsening the mental health of adolescents. If a girl or boy has been abused since their childhood, the prolonged after effects, including mental health issues, will be seen later in their adolescent period. Psychological and emotional abuse in adolescence needs to be on our radar, much more than it is right now, as the only proper way to heal from this type of abuse is through proper medication and counseling. And even with that, this abuse is detrimental to one's development throughout their whole lives. So for the next slide, we are going to be talking about our team perspectives. And I just wanted to talk about something that really interested me during this project was learning that people who have survived early psychological abuse experience what we call survival brain versus what they should have, which is learning brain. This can impact their psychological development at a very young age and will continue to throughout their lives if they don't work on this. This is something that is really important and stuck out to me because as counselors, we will be seeing adults who may have been psychologically abused as children and have had survival brain ever since. And they may have had a hard time adjusting to different social environments and may have had issues within their relationships. So the biggest takeaway for me here was that we need to be aware of this issue as counselors, even if we are not specifically seeing children. And Renee is going to talk about her perspective next.
Thanks. For me, emotional abuse is kind of the invisible abuse. Physical and sexual abuse grabs a lot more headlines. It's something that is sort of been taken under by the legal system, and that leaves emotional abuse pretty much exclusively in the realm of the counseling world, the mental health professionals. And so that makes it so important for us as counselors in training and counselors to understand emotional abuse and to become trained in recognizing the signs and in proper treatment in both children and in adults who suffered as children. And now, Juan, would you share your perspective with us?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I went through this process myself through my children and adolescent years and my brothers as well. So my perspective is at first I had a lot of resistance about the topic, and then I felt very blessed as I kept on reading the articles and receiving all this information. So it's been a great project to put together. And I walk away understanding that it's a very low percentage of actual children that receive the proper treatment, and that many of us is something that we have to later on in our lives decide to get help for. It's unfortunate, but now as counselors, as all of us are becoming counselors, is a great perspective to know that every opportunity we get to impact the life of a child that we suspect is going through emotional abuse, that we need to be involved. I'll be followed now by Drew's recommendation for future research.
I would like to recommend more research on how occasional or frequent emotional abuse affects a child's perspective of abuse. For example, will occasional or continued emotional abuse shift a child's perspective or inference of the abuse to other events as he or she develops? And will there be a shift from what is wrong with dad today to, I guess I deserve this because I'm a bad person? Can further research determine if or when this does happen? And if so, at what point will intervention prevent any lasting changes in inference style?
So this concludes our presentation. If you have any questions about any of the topics that we covered, we are more than welcome to answer any questions you may have. And we hope that you liked our presentation and that you benefit from it.